My name is Dale, and I've been the lead night shift custodian at the O'Connell Medical Research Center for a decade. I've reached a point where the building feels more like a living thing than a collection of limestone and steel. I know which floorboards in the administrative wing groan when the humidity drops, and I know exactly how long the service elevator takes to settle after it reaches the basement. It's a job built on a foundation of solitude and repetition, and for a man like me, that suits just fine. The O'Connell is one of those pre-war structures that keeps its secrets in the shadows of its high ceilings. By 11 p.m., the last of the lab techs usually clear out, leaving the air smelling of ozone and that sharp, industrial-grade lavender I used to prep the lobby. I carry a ring of 42 keys on my right hip. Over the years, that 3-pound weight has worn a permanent indigo fade into the side of my work pants. I can identify every key by touch. The jagged teeth of the master lab key, the smooth, heavy brass of the records vault key. My work is a series of rituals designed to erase the day. I empty the bins, wipe the coffee rings off the mahogany desks, and polish the glass partitions until the researchers' fingerprints vanish. It's a quiet existence, and usually the only sound I have to contend with is the rhythmic jingle of my keys and the low, mechanical hum of the HVAC system. This past Tuesday, the silence felt a little heavier than usual. I started my rounds on the 4th floor. It's a maze of cubicles and private offices. The doctors who work there are brilliant, but they're careless with their spaces. They leave half-eaten sandwiches in the trash and stacks of unsorted memos on every available surface. I was working my way through the northwest corner, my rolling bin trailing behind me with a hollow rattle, when I noticed the door to office 412 was open. I stopped. I knew I had locked that door during my 10:30 p.m. security sweep. It's a habit I don't break. You don't keep a job like this for 10 years by being forgetful. I stepped inside and reached for the light switch. The room was exactly as I had left it, save for one detail. The window, which I had personally checked and latched, was slid open about 3 inches. A cool breeze stirred the papers on the desk. I walked over, gripped the handle, and slid the window shut. I made sure the latch clicked into place. I didn't think much of it at the time. Old buildings have a way of settling, and the latches on the 4th floor have always been a bit temperamental. I locked the door again, tested the handle, and moved to the next wing. At midnight, I took the service elevator down to sublevel 3. This is the bedrock of the O'Connell, a place of exposed pipes and low-hanging ductwork where the cellular signal dies. The records vault is down here, a graveyard of manila folders and rolling metal shelves that haven't seen a flashlight in years. My task in the vault is just to sweep the concrete and check the humidity sensors to make sure the old papers aren't rotting. The elevator ride down is slow. I watch the floor indicator lights, 4, 3, 2, 1, B, feeling the familiar pressure in my ears. When the doors opened, the air was sharp and smelled of wet masonry. I pushed my cleaning cart into the main aisle of the vault. The overhead lights are on a timer, casting long, overlapping shadows across the metal shelves. I began my sweep at the back wall, pulling the wide push broom toward the center of the room. The sound of the bristles against the concrete was the only thing filling the space, a dry, rhythmic scratching. I had walked this exact path 5 minutes earlier to reach the back, and the floor had been clear. As I reached the midpoint of the aisle, my broom caught onto something. I looked down. A small blue plastic cap from a spray bottle was sitting in the center of the floor. It was the same shade of blue as the caps on the glass cleaner I kept on my cart. I checked my cart. Every bottle was upright. Every cap was accounted for. I picked the piece of plastic up and rolled it between my fingers. It was cold, as if it had been sitting in the basement air for hours. I set it on the edge of a shelf and finished my sweep, but the rhythm of the job felt off. The vault felt smaller, the shelves a bit closer together than they had been on my way in. I returned to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors began to slide shut, but then they jolted and reopened. I waited for a few seconds, thinking a sensor might have been tripped by a stray bit of dust, and pressed the button again. The doors closed, the motor hummed, and the lift began to rise. The elevator stopped at sublevel 1. The doors open into the maintenance tunnel that leads into the boiler room. No one should have been on that level to call the lift. I looked out into the tunnel. The emergency lights were flickering, casting a yellow pulse against the concrete walls. The tunnel was empty. I stood in the center of the elevator, my hand resting on the closed door button. Just as the door started to move, I heard a sound from the dark end of the tunnel. It wasn't a scream or a footstep. It was the sound of a broom, the same dry scratching I had been making in the vault. The sound was coming from the direction of the boiler room, moving steadily toward the elevator. I didn't wait to see what was making it. I jammed the button for the lobby, and this time the doors closed with a heavy, final thud. By 2 a.m., I was in the lobby, trying to focus on the floors. The lobby is the heart of the O'Connell, a vast expanse of white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass. It's the brightest part of the building, and usually the place where I feel the most in control. I plugged in the heavy floor buffer, the machine letting out a deep, comforting roar that filled the room. I kept my head down, watching the wax swirl into a high-gloss finish. I worked in long, overlapping arcs, the vibration of the machine numbing my hands. In the reflection of the wet marble, I could see the dark balconies of the floors above. They looked like empty theater boxes. I pushed the buffer toward the main entrance. In the polished surface of the floor, I saw a reflection of the second floor railing. Someone was standing there, looking down. It was just a silhouette, a dark shape against the dim lights of the administrative wing. I didn't look up. I've lived long enough to know that your eyes can play tricks on you in a building this old. I turned the buffer to start the next row, keeping my gaze fixed on the marble. In the new reflection, the figure was gone. I finished the lobby and switched off the machine. The silence that followed was so sudden it felt like a wait. I stood there, catching my breath, and reached for my keys to lock the equipment cabinet. The ring was gone. I looked at my belt loop. The heavy brass clip was still there, but the ring itself, the 42 keys I'd carried for a decade, was missing. I retraced my steps across the lobby, my eyes scanning the marble. I found them in the center of the room. They weren't dropped, they were placed. The keys were laid out in a perfect straight line across the floor, organized by size from the smallest cabinet key to the largest master. They sat in a pool of light from the street lamp outside, the metal gleaming. I picked them up, the metal cold and biting against my palm. As I stood there, the service elevator at the back of the lobby chimed. The doors opened, and the empty car sat waiting, its light spilling onto the floor. It had come up from the basement without being called. I looked at the floor indicator inside the car. The button for the third floor, the morgue and pathology labs, was illuminated. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 a.m. I had 3 hours left of my shift. I gripped the keys until my knuckles turned white, then I walked toward the elevator. I had a job to do, and at the O'Connell, the job always comes first. I stood in the center of the lobby, the weight of the keys in my hand feeling colder than the air-conditioned draft. The silence of the O'Connell was no longer a companion, it was a witness. I looked at the marble floor I had just finished buffing. The reflection was perfect, a dark mirror of the ceiling, but my own shadow seemed a fraction too long, stretching toward the elevators as if it were impatient to return to the basement. I walked toward the service lift. My boots made a faint, tacky sound on the fresh wax, a noise that felt like a trespass. I pressed the button for the third floor. I didn't have a reason to go back up, other than the fact that the building seemed to expect it. The elevator climbed with a slow, hydraulic groan, the floor indicator lights ticking past in the dim car. The doors opened on the third floor, and the scent hit me, a sharp, stinging wall of industrial bleach. It was a smell I knew well, but it was out of place. I hadn't started the deep clean on the pathology wing yet. That was scheduled for the final hour of my shift. I stepped out onto the linoleum and stopped. The hallway was gleaming. The overhead fluorescence hummed with a low-frequency buzz that made the hair on my arm stand up. I walked toward Lab 302. I reached for my master key, but the handle turned before I could even select the right one. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room was pristine. The stainless steel prep tables were devoid of smudges, and the waste bins had been emptied, fitted with fresh white liners. Every chair was tucked neatly under its station, aligned with mathematical precision. In the center of the main table, a single yellow cleaning rag sat, folded into a perfect square. I picked it up. It was damp and smelled slightly of lemons. It was my rag. I recognized the frayed corner where I caught it on a jagged shelf in the basement weeks ago. It was a tool I had lost, now returned to me, cleaned and folded by a hand I hadn't seen. I exited the lab and moved further down the hall, my pace quickening. The feeling of being crowded in an empty space was becoming physical, a pressure in the back of my throat. Every door I tested was the same. Lab 304, 305, the storage closets, all unlocked, all spotless. I pushed through the double doors of the morgue vestibule. The temperature dropped instantly. The air was heavy with the hum of refrigeration compressors, a sound like a distant mechanical beehive. I walked toward the central prep area, my eyes scanning the shadows. On the far wall, the heavy steel door to the cold storage room was slightly ajar. A thin, pale mist curled out from the gap, illuminated by the dim blue light inside the unit. I walked toward it, my hand tightening around the keyring on my hip to keep it from jingling. I expected to find a faulty latch or a lingering researcher who had forgotten to put the door shut. Instead, I found my bucket. It was the gray plastic mop bucket from my cart, the one with a cracked handle I'd been meaning to replace for 3 months. It was sitting just inside the cold storage room, filled with soapy water. A mop was leaning against the stainless steel wall next to it. I looked at the water. A few gray suds were still popping on the surface. Someone had just been using it. I stepped back, my heart thumping a dull, steady rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the rows of silver drawers, each holding a body that was no longer a person. They were silent, indifferent to the cleanliness of the room. I grabbed the handle of the bucket and put it out into the vestibule. As I did, a small piece of paper fluttered off to the side and landed on the floor. It was a page from my own maintenance log, the one I keep on the clipboard in the basement. I picked it up. In the comments section, where I usually note things like burnt out bulbs or leaky faucets, there was a single line of text written in a cramped, precise hand. 3:24 a.m. Floors polished. Surfaces sterilized. Check the drain in 308. I folded the paper and shoved it into my pocket. I didn't go to lab 308. I didn't check the drain. I turned the bucket over, poured the soapy water down the floor drain in the vestibule, and headed for the stairs. I took 2 steps at a time, the jingle of my keys sounding frantic in the narrow concrete shaft. I reached the lobby and looked around at the security kiosk. The chair was empty. The monitors flickered with gray and white feeds of empty hallways and still labs. The night guard was nowhere to be seen, likely on a perimeter walk or asleep in a break room. I walked back to the center of the lobby and looked at the floor I had waxed earlier. On the edge of the rug, near the front door, I noticed a small, wet footprint. Just one. It was the tread of a work-ready boot, size 11. I looked at my own boots. They were dry. I checked the security monitor for the basement maintenance office. My office. The lights were on. The door was open. And sitting on my desk, right next to my coffee thermos, was a second yellow cleaning rag, folded into a perfect square. I checked the clock on the wall. 4 a.m. 2 hours left. I adjusted my belt, gripped my broom, and headed back down toward the elevator. The building was clean, but the shift wasn't over until the sun hit the glass. The elevator hummed as I descended back to the 3rd floor. I didn't want to go to lab 308, but the logic of the night shift is hard to break. If a task is logged, it must be verified. My boots felt heavier on the linoleum, the sound of my footstep amplified by the sterile, polished walls. I reached the door to 308. It was the only lab on this floor without a window in the door, a heavy slab of reinforced oak that kept the interior shielded from the hallway light. I slid my key into the lock, but the bolt had already been thrown. I pushed it open. The room was dark. I reached for the light switch, but the toggle clicked uselessly in my hand. The only illumination came from the faint green glow of a backup power indicator on one of the centrifuges. It cast a long, sickly shadow across the floor. I moved my flashlight beam toward the center of the room. The floor drain was a circular iron grate set into the tile, designed to handle chemical spills or washdowns. Usually, it was dry. Tonight, a thick, dark liquid was bubbling up from the throat of the pipe. It wasn't water, it was viscous and opaque, spreading across the pristine tile in a slow, silent pool. I knelt beside the drain. The smell was overwhelming. Not the sharp bite of bleach or the medicinal tang of the labs, but something organic and old, like the silt at the bottom of a riverbed. I reached for my utility belt to find a wrench, thinking a seal had perished, but my hand stopped. The liquid wasn't just pooling, it was vibrating. Small rhythmic ripples moved from the center of the drain toward the edges of the room, timed perfectly with a sound coming from deep within the pipes. A wet, hollow thud. It sounded like a heartbeat, heavy and slow, muffled by several feet of concrete and iron. I shone my light directly into the drain. The grate was missing. I hadn't noticed it at first, but the heavy iron disc had been removed and set neatly on the counter nearby. I looked down into the black throat of the pipe. 6 inches down, something was looking back. It wasn't an eye, it was a reflection, a small silver spark of light caught on a glass surface. I leaned closer, my breath hitching. Resting on a ledge inside the pipe was a pocket watch. It was silver, the casing tarnished with age. I reached down, my fingers brushing against the cold, oily liquid, and pulled it out. I wiped the mug from the glass with my thumb. The watch was still ticking. I turned it over. Scratched into the back of the case was a single word: Dale. I stood up, the watch heavy in my palm. This wasn't mine. I don't own a pocket watch, and I never have. But the name was there. The letters weren't smooth, as if they had been handled for decades. The thumping in the pipe stopped. The liquid began to recede, gurgling back down the drain with a series of wet, choking gasps. I backed out of the lab, closing the door and locking it. I didn't care about the task list anymore. I didn't care about the wax or the trash. I headed for the stairs, the silver watch tucked deep in my pocket. By 5:30 a.m., the first hints of gray light began to bleed through the lobby windows. I stood by the front entrance, my back to the security kiosk. I didn't look at the monitors. I didn't look for the man in the blue jumpsuit on the balcony. I just watched the street lamps outside flicker and die as the city began to wake. The pneumatic hiss of the front door signaled the start of the morning shift. The day porter, a young man named Jerry, walked in, shaking a wet umbrella. He smelled of rain and tobacco, the smells of the world outside. He nodded at me as he passed, a brief, casual acknowledgement of the man who had held the fort. "Morning, Dale," he said, heading for the service elevator. "Quiet night?" "Quiet enough," I replied. My voice sounded strange, a dry rattle in the back of my throat that I didn't recognize. I walked out to my truck. The air was cool and damp, the morning fog clinging to the limestone walls of the O'Connell. I sat in the cab for a moment, the engine idling, and pulled the pocket watch from my pocket. The silver was bright now, the tarnish gone as if the morning air had polished it. I looked at the face. It wasn't 6 a.m. The hands were fixed at 4:12. I reached for the ignition to put the truck into gear, but my hand felt stiff. I looked at my cuticles. There was a thin line of gray, chalky dust settled under the skin, a fine residue that wouldn't rub off. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather cold against my palms, and I drove out of the lot. As I reached the main road, I looked in the rearview mirror. High up on the 3rd floor, in the window of Lab 308, the lights were on. A man in a navy blue jumpsuit was standing at the glass. He wasn't waving. He was holding a yellow rag, wiping away a smudge I must have missed. I turned the corner and the building vanished behind the trees. I reached into my pocket to pull the watch away, but my hand met only empty fabric. The watch was gone. I checked the seat, the floorboards, the glove box. Nothing. I reached my house and sat on the porch, watching the sun finally break the ridge. I was home. I was safe. But as I reached for my front door handle, I noticed something on the mat. It was a small, white porcelain dish. Inside, a single peppermint candy sat waiting. I didn't pick it up. I walked inside, locked the door, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't check the hallway. I just sat in the kitchen and listened to the house settle, waiting for the silence to return to a state of stasis. I knew then that I would never return to the O'Connell Medical Research Center again.